On this episode of Narcissist Apocalypse Q&A, we talk with licensed professional counselor and chemical dependency counselor Brandee Smith, who specializes in addiction, infidelity, and narcissistic abuse. And we discuss process addiction, codependency, and the importance of keeping yourself in check after your abusive relationship is over. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse Q&A. I am Brandon Chadwick, and this is a podcast that interviews mental health professionals, lawyers, researchers, and authors about narcissistic and domestic abuse. And before we get into our episode, let me state that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. Please do not substitute the show for medical advice. If you are struggling, please do reach out to the current professional you use, or please do call your local domestic abuse agency. Speaking of professionals, we just started our own directory of mental health professionals at abusetherapy.org. So if you're looking for someone to talk to, like Brandee Smith, please do go to abusetherapy.org to find help. Using one of the professionals from our directory helps support the show. We'll be adding as many diverse professionals as we can, and if you're a professional looking to be part of our directory, please do email me at directory@abusetherapy.org. But do you know what else helps support this show? Our Patreon. Yes, we started a Patreon. If you want to hear episodes that never made it to air, follow-up episodes with former guests, and much more, join our Patreon. We'll be releasing new content on there every week. So to help support the show, become a patron of our Patreon at patreon.com/narcissistapocalypse. Other things on our website at narcissistapocalypse.com is high conflict parenting courses that we are now offering. And that can be found at narcissistapocalypse.com/courses. Yes, we have now partnered with an online parenting company, and many of the courses we are offering were created by Bill Eddy. And if you'd listened to our episode last year with a divorce lawyer named Helen, you'll know that Bill Eddy is an expert in dealing with individuals in court, and he's now helped create many parenting courses to help you through divorce and to help support your children too. These courses are the most widely recognized courses by family courts across the country. So if you want to support the show and are looking for guidance, please do go to narcissistapocalypse.com/courses. And before I get out of my way and your way and start the show, thank you to everyone who came by our website at narcissistapocalypse.com and filled out an application to be on our sister podcast, Narcissist Apocalypse Survivor Stories. If you have not received an email from me yet, please do check your junk mail. And now it's time for the show. Here is my interview with Brandee Smith. Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse Q&A. With me today, I have Brandee Smith. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking.
Well, everyone who has not heard you before, you've been on an earlier episode, and you are a licensed professional counselor, a licensed chemical dependency counselor with a focus on trauma, and one of your specialties is infidelity as well. You're a non-judgmental therapist where your clients feel validated, acknowledged, and respected, which, as many of our listeners know, finding one like that is not easy. You are based in Austin, Texas, and you are at fortifycounselingservices.com. That's where people can find you. You are statewide online, and when this pandemic is over, hopefully it will be over soon, you can be seen in person in Austin, Texas. And today, we are going to talk about addiction and narcissistic abuse, and not just chemical or alcohol type dependency. We're also going to discuss love addiction, and I've been waiting to do this episode with you because I have so many questions about how the brain works as far as it being a body dependency and how it works in comparison to other types of dependencies. So, I am not an expert, but when I was thinking about this topic, I saw it as a cycle for addicts who are victims of abuse. The love bomb will happen. You'll get hooked. It becomes a love addiction. It gets taken away. It's given back. It's taken away. But then to cope better, other addictions get thrown in to fill the void. Am I off base here? Can you explain addiction and how it's formed? Are there certain people that are more susceptible to falling into the addiction trap? Where does it all begin? And are all addictions chemical based? I threw a lot at you at once, so
yeah, I was about to say, you can sit back and relax. That's a lot of information, but yeah. So let's go back to the initial part of your question, which is the cycle for addicts who are victims of abuse. You're not going to find love addiction in the DSM-5. That's our industry standard diagnostic and statistical manual. That's how we, quantify mental illness. And so for me, the thinking and the behavior associated with codependency and the concept of love addiction really go hand in hand. So I sort of hesitate to call it love addiction because what we're talking about is an unhealthy triggering of our brain's reward system. So when you use the word addiction, it's important to differentiate. There's a couple of kinds of addictions and ways that our brains respond. One of them is a process addiction, which is what I think most folks are referring to when they talk about love addiction. And then also substance use disorders. So the obvious difference there is being whether or not a substance is involved versus behavior. And the only process, I double-checked this so I would get it right, the only process addiction with diagnostic criteria right now in the DSM is gambling. That's the only one. So there's a lot of talk thrown around about internet addiction, sex addiction, but we can kind of group all of those as process addiction. There's just a lack of evidence, peer-reviewed evidence, that sort of has kept the powers that be from settling on what kind of diagnostic criteria and the course of the disease that we could really quantify. So we're looking at two things. The behavior is one kind of addiction. They ping the same part of our brain's reward system, though, and that's how they're similar. Mm-hmm.
So, because I was thinking about gambling addiction because I come from a family of gamblers, mm-hmm. and
okay.
It's an offshoot of as most addictions are, all addictions, they're an offshoot of pain or filling voids that you might be having. I myself at one time had a gambling issue, but I'm someone who can take their addiction and switch it before it becomes a big problem. For me,
mm-hmm.
Because I've gone to chemical dependency and I've gone to that. They both, in my mind, I mean, they're really, with chemical addiction, I can feel it. I guess I can feel it more in my body.
Mm-hmm.
And then with gambling, I guess in a certain way, I do feel it in my body, or maybe haven't paid attention enough during that time, because once it's kind of in your head, or that for me, it's once that thought process is in your head, it's hard to get that out of your head. Even you're like, don't do it. And it's there and it kind of just rolls and rolls along. So when it comes to, I guess, codependency, and it being more of a thought process or a process addiction, how can people, what type of people are more susceptible, I guess, to being codependent? And I guess, where does it all begin in childhood, or is it for some people can happen in a narcissistic abuse relationship?
Well, so in terms of, when we think about trying to explain addiction and how it's formed, you make a good point when you say you experience a different feeling in your body, right? There's that kind of physical response to illness, right? And the progression of the disease, it manifests in physical ways. The process addiction lacks that to some degree. We were not going to see, liver damage from a process addiction. I would imagine there's some anecdotal anxiety effects, but in general, that's going to be the difference. So explaining addiction and how it's formed is a really extensive topic, right? We could spend a lifetime digging into just this one question. But the way I like to really break it down in the most simple terms is that we can determine one of the factors is we can determine a person has an addiction when they continue to engage in a behavior in spite of the obvious negative consequences. Right, so that's where I start with clients when we're trying to decide whether or not they have an addiction issue. So the behaviors we're talking about range from tension at home to a DWI to patterns of behaviors in relationships. So it negatively impacts your social functioning, professional functioning, recreational functioning. So problematic substance abuse or process addiction really boils down to a lack of healthy coping skills, right? It is to your point, you mentioned filling that void. We've run out of other options to soothe ourselves, and so that's what we're trying to do. And in terms of substance abuse, even though someone's initial substance use is maybe voluntary, right, recreational, just trying things out, neurobiological changes take place over time, and the same thing happens over time with process addiction. And what happens is the ability to make healthy behavioral choices decreases, right? So when you talk about susceptibility, there are several factors. There's genetic factors, there's environmental factors that increase the likelihood that a person may develop a substance use disorder or process addiction. And those don't guarantee, of course, that someone is destined to do it, but we find these commonalities among them. So one of them is genetic predisposition, right? So there are studies that vary about how much we can attribute to genetics, but it ranges anywhere from 50 to 75% of the total risk factor for someone to be addicted. There's certain brain characteristics that just make someone more vulnerable to addictive substances than the average person. Of course, there's psychological factors, stress, personality traits, mental illness, other mental illness, coexisting depression, anxiety, other psychiatric disorders, and of course, environmental influences are big. There's so much around trauma survivors, right, which is important here, and that physical, sexual, emotional abuse, substance use in the family, that behavior is modeled for us, even the access that a person has to an addictive substance has a factor, and then also there is some impact about the acceptability of use in the culture at large. So, and the last one that's important is the earlier you start to use a substance, the higher your risk is to become addicted. So it's a lot of stuff. And,
I always like to say that when you are in a romantic relationship with a narcissist, and the whole love bombing stage occurs, that the love bombing is technically a shot of drugs, and it is a shot of, emotional heroin. And that kind of keeps you back, and you keep on chasing the dragon, and how that's the old term I guess they used in the opium den days. And you keep going back and forth, and you're being ping-ponged, and you're kind of looking for that next bit of love or codependency. Is that a fair assessment when it comes to how the initial stages of narcissistic abuse plays out?
Well, absolutely. When we're talking about the course of addiction and what is happening, whether it's process or substance, it's the effect on the brain's reward system. If you are behaving in a way that increases or surges your dopamine, then we're going to do more of that. And the brain's going to try and balance things out. And then that's going to throw things off even further. And then we introduce more dopamine, and the cycle just grows on itself. And over time, it can make permanent changes. So yes, both of those things, they have a direct effect on the reward system, which is all we're really talking about, is that being out of balance, difficulty controlling impulsivity, is that impulsiveness is affected as well by these chemical imbalances. So, and we can create that same, we can mimic that same situation by our emotional response, our behaviors that our brain finds rewarding. We just want some dopamine as much as we can get. So yeah, I would agree that cycle does parallel substance abuse.
So many people in abusive relationships become addicts themselves. And then when they are in romantic relationships, their partner may encourage that behavior initially and then use it against them. And it's very confusing for someone who is currently in the middle of something like this in this situation. So is there anything is there anything possible for them to do to somehow shake them loose in the sense of being in this cycle of this positive reinforcement for this behavior that is hurting them, and then in return being shamed for this behavior that is being encouraged? It's a weird cycle, and a lot of people are in that cycle. So, and they can't see outside of it. So, if anyone is listening who's might be in that cycle, is there anything that you could recommend for them to do to break their way out, if that's possible?
Sure. Well, I think the first part of that answer is to say there's a whole different set, aside from the dependency cycle that we run into, there's a whole different set of ways to disentangle and remove yourself from an abusive situation. That in and of itself is such an intense trauma that those two things are now, the complication of both of them, combining them, is a really heavy burden to bear. So first, you're not alone. That's not uncommon. And a lot of people use, even if it's not being used as a tool against someone, it's often used to self-soothe, as I mentioned. And so it does pop up a lot of times when people are suffering abuse, because there's very little relief from that. So they attempt to numb. But in terms of it being used as a tool, I think that also relates back to a person's ability, their capacity, and their willingness to be able to break free. That is just another tool in a narcissist toolbox, I think, to manipulate and control. So it comes down really, I think, to a pretty straightforward answer. We adapt, right? If the substance use or the protective behavior changes, if they provide relief, we'll take it. So people in abusive situations, people dealing with a narcissist, there has to be a moment in time where there is an intrinsic motivation to prioritize their own health and well-being. Got to be in a place where substance abuse or trauma, narcissism, dealing with a person with narcissism in a relationship, there's a point in time where you make a decision when you can, right? No judgment about that, but when you can, to start taking steps for change. And I think those things can come at the same time. Maybe we address one of the issues before the other one. But when you're willing and able to start executing on your, prioritizing your own health as non-negotiable, that starts the healing. And this is one of the things that really helps us get better and recover, is finding healthier ways to cope.
And the next question I have for you is, when you're trying to leave, this is a big problem for a lot of people. When you're trying to leave a narcissist, everyone hears about hoovering and the importance of staying no contact, and it's very difficult for a lot of people. I see a lot of questions, around the internet is how do I stay no contact, which is just a really big thing. So, when you relate this to this being, let's say, a codependent and an addiction kind of issue, how does this relate to, I guess the parallel of detoxing and withdrawals? And should someone in this spot use like a 12-step method, just like in the addiction programs, or should they have a sponsor? Should they do check-ins? What would your recommendation be when it comes to this no contact phase when you are leaving?
Well, so once you've made a decision, the decision I was talking about to break from a toxic, abusive relationship, we've got to start thinking with the cognitive part of our brain and balance out the emotional part of our brain, because the emotional part of our brain does not engage rationality. That's not part of its job. And so I can't think of a single good reason to expose yourself to it again. And the same thing is true in substance abuse. Part of coping with that over a lifetime is to say, I've got to be aware of my triggers, where I may be challenged to resist an impulse, and where I can potentially get tripped up, and with intention and purpose, minimize the presence of those triggers in my life. So I don't see those sort of hoovering maneuvers as any different than monitoring triggers, right? If I reject and have no contact, I have relieved myself of the responsibility of navigating that moment in time. And that is not, I think it's different than avoidance. I think it is an intentional choosing something different. And so, if I have an alcohol problem, there's a lot better places that I can work than a bar. If I have a problem with infidelity, I need to have my dinner in my room, not downstairs in the hotel bar. So it's just sort of managing, once you make that decision, maximizing the opportunity you have for success. So for some people, that's moderating use. For some people, it's abstaining. In terms of a toxic relationship or abuse situation, there is no need to interact at all. There's no upside to that. And we can be vulnerable. These people who have been abusive to us know those vulnerabilities and use them to their advantage. So better to avoid that altogether. And then we don't have to address it in any way at all. So in terms of the last part of your question, you might be surprised to hear I'm not really a big fan of 12-step programs.
Okay.
So, yeah, before anybody gets upset about that, because people do, they really get upset about that, I readily agree. 12-step programs have saved lives, right? They've helped millions of people. There is no argument there. I just think that there are some newer evidence-based approaches to peer support, peer recovery, that are more in line with our current understanding of addiction and recovery. So again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying do not go to those programs, but I am saying be intentional about your choosing. Pay attention to what's going to work best for you, because 12-step isn't necessarily the right choice for everybody. What I am a fan of is the idea of peer recovery support groups, whether it's trauma survivors, people in substance use recovery. So peer support groups, individual therapy is an important thing, a component of healing. A lot of times those groups are used to help maintain personal accountability. I think that's an important part, being accountable to other people. And then also cultivating a strong social support network is really important too. In both cases, whether it's a process addiction or substance addiction, those things are key to long-term recovery.
And for my own personal experience with both of these situations, I've been to Codependence Anonymous. Mm-hmm. I was not a fan.
You weren't? Okay.
I was not a fan mainly because of the mood that was in the room. It wasn't. I didn't find it useful, and I'm sure from different groups to different groups. But the local one where I am, I was just when I was sitting in the room, I didn't feel encouraged to get better, And I just didn't, it wasn't that I didn't feel supported, and that I couldn't talk about anything I wanted. I just felt that there was a dark cloud, and I didn't want to be in a dark cloud. I wanted to be, surrounded by people who were, had more experience on getting to the other side. So a mixture of people who were better and people who were new. And mine was just a lot of new people, and I just didn't feel for myself that it was a great place to be.
Then you made an excellent decision not to go.
Yeah,
because it can be detrimental. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that I've had clients who have told me they drink to go to an AA meeting. Been able to sit there and endure some of the more difficult parts of that meeting. I feel like in terms of modeling, I think there's modeling recovery, especially in peer groups. There's a lot of important things to be discovered about the roots of our illness or our challenges. But there is a point in time at which we need to be outcomes oriented, forward-looking, and be, sharing that positive support. Sometimes I think that past work that feels like you can be just sort of telling war stories or stuck in a place. Maybe those kinds of issues are better resolved more effectively on an individual basis. I think those meetings, some of them in that sort of old-fashioned kind of model, can be very triggering for people, and we don't want that.
No, and when I was able to get myself off of drugs, I did it not through going to a 12-step program. I actually did it with one friend of mine who I knew was struggling as well. And I felt they were struggling more than I was. And I said to myself, I don't want my friend to go down deeper into a hole. So, what I did, I wanted to be the best example possible. I wasn't even doing it for myself, technically. I was just like, here's my friend, let's do this together. And we established a regular, everyday Wednesday phone call where no matter what, we had to be honest that, yes, we used stuff, and we just say, yes, we did. I will not judge you, and I will not shame you. We're going to go through these mistakes, and we're also, if you are feeling like you are going to do something, you make the phone call. And then if you didn't make that phone call on Wednesday, admit that you didn't make the phone call.
Right, absolutely.
And
that's accountability is a critical and being able to do that in a loving space, which is what it sounds like you two created for each other.
Yeah, and we did it, and I got, I think, to the other side first. I then had a relapse, but I was able to find my way back, and my friend did as well.
Congratulations. That is a wonderful accomplishment.
Yeah, we were pretty proud of ourselves that we were able to kind of do it in our own way, using each other as our own rocks. And when it came to listening to stories of people of narcissistic abuse and triggers, to me, I guess the biggest trigger would be social media, and how everyone should turn off their social media when just to me, it's like erase your account. Don't even have the temptation. If you have it on your computer, log yourself out.
And especially, we could do a whole episode on that. It's very difficult to find an upside to that, except for, I guess, the social connection. But yeah, from there, it really tapers off pretty dramatically in terms of positive return.
Yeah,
what you mentioned raised an important point, I think, especially for narcissistic survivors, or not narcissistic abuse survivors, is that there are times when, so we go seek help and it doesn't feel like a good fit and we stay at it anyway, and we get frustrated with ourselves that we can't do recovery. We can't even do recovery right. which is, a lie that we get told. That's a really staple kind of weapon used against abused people in relationships. And so it just sort of plays into that narrative. So I think it's important to message to people, every single method is not going to be right for every person. So all it means, if one attempt at recovery isn't a good fit, you can just leave it at meaning this attempt at recovery wasn't a good fit, not a failure. Okay, let me try something different much in the same way that you did, right? We don't have to regard those things as success or failures or inability to do something right. I think we've got to be open and non-judgmental about all the options available to us and finding a space that resonates and that, will promote a long-term positive outcome.
And just to also say, I have gone to one specific meeting that I did enjoy, and the only reason I did enjoy it because it was all based around guided meditation.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It really. So we were in there and we were doing our own work, even though we were there as a collective. And sometime, at the beginning, people would speak, and that would be for the first 15 minutes, and then we would break off into separate groups of guided meditation. And I found, after the guided meditation would happen, people would talk about their experience in their guided meditation if they wanted to. And I found that just to be uplifting and a positive experience. And that was kind of what I was looking for, which is hard to find.
I'm glad you. I mean, meditation and mindfulness, they're healing. They're just flat healing, and everyone should practice them. I think and then I like the structure of the meeting you're describing too. That is, it does sort of shift the dynamic of the focus, what you guys are looking at in terms of that meeting, what you're sharing, what you're supporting, rather than sort of digging into the past a little bit. So good for you. I'm glad you found that meeting.
Yeah. It was a wonderful meeting. And now we're going to move on to the next little question I have on my thing here. It says, they say once you're an addict, you're always an addict. I believe that is true. So even in the aftermath of abuse, if you were a love addict or a codependent, you'll still have that addiction in you. I guess is this going to be like a lifelong thing for people, or is this something when it comes to codependency and narcissistic abuse? Is it something that's going to stick with you your whole entire life, or is it something that after you do the first bit of work, you won't have an issue with it anymore?
Well, I think when we talk about addiction, we've got to talk about the disease model. So from the disease model perspective, that means it's a chronic condition that has to be managed, right? So whether you have fallen into this cycle, this distorted brain function with the reward system and all of those chemical imbalances that happen, those create behavior patterns, which create bad habits, which create compromised functioning, all of those things. So regardless of what the instigator of that, the catalyst to that process or substance, I think treating these things as a chronic condition is important. So once a person's stabilized as you can be in your recovery from whether it's a relationship or anything, managing addictive behaviors is really no different than treating any other condition. So if we use diabetes as an example, so people with diabetes, they have to manage their diet. They have to monitor their blood sugar. Maybe they take insulin. So, and nobody gets upset about that. There's no judgment about that, right? But in terms of addiction, there seems to be so much judgment around that because people with diabetes, they may choose not to do those things and they will become ill. And I think it's important to normalize addiction as a disease model because that is the same phenomenon that happens with people who lapse or relapse in those conditions. They have not chosen the things that they know will help them be better. There's some negative consequences. But a person with diabetes can start monitoring their blood sugar, take some medicine, manage their diet, and become well once again. So I think it is an ongoing condition that has to be paid attention to, not a hypervigilance, right? Or because then that becomes a whole different problem in and of itself. But I think some of the important things that people in recovery from addiction can do is get a whole stock and inventory of alternative, healthier coping skills. Things that a diverse set of tools that you can use. Pull out one. If that doesn't work, I'm going to do something different, and be able to self-soothe in a healthier way. Continue to treat underlying coexisting physical or mental health conditions. That's really important. There's a whole lot of connection between our mind and body in terms of if our feelings affect our thinking and vice versa, for sure. So I think it's important over time to manage triggers, to know what they are and manage them. And then again, also be engaged socially, whether that's a friend network, a peer recovery. I think those things apply to a person who is codependent as well, not just substance.
And as a codependent person myself, my recent examples for me are, I always have to keep in check am I overdoing something with someone or am I underdoing something with someone? So when I look at it in the terms of in that way, so if I'm about to go out with someone I like and I'm talking with them for a while, am I going over and above or am I underdoing things? Is everything in balance? And I keep on having to go through that process for myself to keep myself in check, so I know that my codependent behavior is kind of monitored.
Kudos. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? Because these experiences that we have that create these dysfunctional responses, they are unique to each of us. Every person has their own version of that experience, and so this is an area where you need to focus. You've done some introspection, figured that out. We don't need to judge that. All we need to do is say, okay, I need to think about my thinking. This is a sensitive area for me where I'm challenged. So all we want to do is spot the red flags as early in the thinking process as possible, right? When we do that, we may not be perfect 100% of the time, but we're definitely going to decrease the incidences of lapse or relapse. So no one's better able to judge those things than the individual involved, which is exactly what you just described.
Yeah, and for me, looking at it in terms of overdoing and underdoing has been the most kind of beneficial thing for me to use as a monitor or as a gauge. And I look at my past experiences and I look at what a healthy relationship is supposed to look like. And then I kind of say, okay, I judge it. And then I'm like, okay, then I'm good.
You're right.
Or
maybe I'm not.
Recently I was like, no, you weren't good there. Maybe this person you shouldn't be hanging out with because you are going above and beyond. And it's not that they were expecting you to do that, but for me specifically in this situation, I was waiting around a lot. I was waiting around and letting things slide. And, if I wasn't waiting around, so, it was just an imbalance. And when we really got back to me being in a balance, what's the best way to put it? My view of the other person was more of they're just going to kind of do what they're going to do. You weren't a priority, whereas you were making them a priority. So let's get yourself back into, if they're not making you a priority, then you shouldn't make them, and maybe you shouldn't really be involved and take it the next step further, because if you do take it the next step, then you're just going down the road of the possibility of being back in a narcissistic abuse relationship.
Exactly. So we're looking for our personal red flags and managing them as soon as possible, and at the same time reducing the risky situations that we put ourselves in, right?
Yeah.
Don't ignore those indicators that you get, right? It's this, and we can see them and identify them by the negativity that we feel, right? I'm imagining that you might have felt frustrated, waiting, or hurt, or sad, trying to, when this was so out of balance, and that's the indicator. When we have that, we don't need to judge it. It's just a sign to say something's off. And then you proceed to the next step, which is, okay, where's my checklist, my emotional checklist? And which is, you did the work to identify that as a good criterion for moving forward in a relationship. Yeah, the last thing I want to say about that is that whole process, that recognizing where you're challenged, where you could make different decisions in the future, it is so important to not attach shame or guilt or judgment about that, just to leave it that it is a neutral thing. It happens. And the upside is that there's benefit and growth from it. But feeling guilt or shame or any of those other things that are so inherent in abusive situations and relationships with friends and family of an addicted person, it doesn't help. It complicates things. It actually just sort of gets everything all blurry, and it doesn't help at all. So I think just having some gratitude for the lesson is important.
So in your practice, how do you go about treating someone who has a dual addiction and abuse issues? Where would you even begin?
Well, so every client is wonderfully unique, and so that's a tough one to answer. Typically, there was a school of thought some time ago that you attacked one problem at a time, and so a person recovering from abuse likely has trauma and trauma symptoms, and so there was sort of this, I guess, belief that the standard was to get the alcohol or the substance use under control and then focus on the other. And that has changed. I think we recognize that working on all of the things are important, and we can do that at the same time. There's a high incidence of substance abuse with people with mental disorders. That diagnosis happens a lot, and it's not rocket science to figure out. Here again rears its ugly head, this lack of coping skills, right? So if I'm struggling with mental illness, it's creating negative consequences in my life and relationships and work. I need some sort of relief. And if I run out of ideas, I might choose that one, which develops into this vicious cycle and eventually doesn't do the thing that it started out doing in the beginning. It creates its own set of problems. So to directly answer your question, in terms of a substance use disorder, you have to treat trauma very specifically. That's talk therapy, EMDR, for working with the sort of childhood issues, right? The ways that we think about things, examining that. Self-esteem issues, and specifically in terms of addiction, the path I think is learning alternative coping skills. Right, we're going to focus on appropriate ongoing treatment of any underlying or coexisting physical concerns, the identifying triggers, and then also making sure that we counter the addictive kind of thinking with alternative motivators. Just to say that when I tell myself I'll feel better if I drink, or I'll just take this one phone call from this person, saying to yourself, reinstituting the logical side of your brain to say that's actually not true. I actually won't feel better, and reintegrating that into the work. The thing that I think is key to successful outcomes with any kind of therapy or treatment is intrinsic motivation. Right? I have got to, on my own, decide that I'm ready to make these changes can't be forced into it, can't be pressured into it, it's not going to work. So I tend to do some motivational interviewing at the beginning to try and figure out who wants you to be here. Is it you or is it somebody else? Because if it isn't you, we should wait.
And, is that rare for a rehab center or a therapist to even go through that process? Because, I've known many people who have been sent places to heal themselves, to get better, and they were not ready at all. So it was a useless exercise. They were just waiting for their 30 to 60 days to kind of be up, and then they're right back to where they began.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can only speak, I guess, for myself. And I've worked in hospitals. As a clinician, we don't assume we know anything, but there are indicators of a person who is intrinsically motivated versus extrinsically motivated. And there is an ownership and accountability, just a sort of energy and enthusiasm that is different from a person who doesn't want to work. It just flat doesn't work. You're absolutely right. If a person is not in a space where the desire is to feel healthier and change all these negative consequences, it simply will fail. There's just no way to do it. I have on occasion had conversations with clients of mine, and we've had to really get down to the truth of the matter and ask if they're ready to stop drinking or using. And if the answer is no, we have to look at what our treatment goal is going forward. If not that, then what? And, I do want to say, too, you don't have to stop using to seek treatment, right? And you don't have to feel ashamed if you use while you're in treatment. There's just work to be done. So you don't have to abstain. You don't have to be in any particular place to go get some help. And hopefully you're going to find someone who just works with things as they come in terms of a clinician that's just accepting of that. But yeah, I think it's a key. I think it's an issue that has to be addressed directly. If a person is on board with recovery or not, the work is too hard to not want it on your own for yourself.
So now it's time for audience questions. And our first one is, are narcissists addicts and we're just their drug?
Okay, so I suppose, given all we've talked about, we could say yes, but it feels like, to me, like an oversimplification of a pretty complex pattern of abusive codependent behaviors, right? I can see the connection with the brain's reward system, but a personality disorder is different than an addiction. I think there's some fundamental differences in terms of pathology.
And the next question is, and this is a common question, and a very important question, in my opinion. I don't know if my partner is just an addict or are they a narcissist as well. How do I tell?
Well, so I think the answer to that really circles back around, I think, to what we were discussing at the beginning of the podcast. Does your partner continue to engage in behavior or despite clearly negative consequences? So that's a good place to start. So if there is use involved, can they acknowledge and say this is a problem? Some can, some can't, but that's a question that can be asked. And then I think narcissism, again, is a little more pathological. There is a almost impossibility of a narcissist taking any kind of responsibility for the havoc that they are wreaking on people. So I think insight is an important part of that distinction, and that's an individual sort of because narcissists don't really see the problem, and I think with addiction we have a better insight to the negative impacts that are, even if we're not willing to change anything, we acknowledge the behavior is unhealthy.
Yeah, and a personal note, a narcissist will not call you to apologize out of the blue, like how some people as I got a phone call this year from a former addict who is a friend of mine from many years ago, who I have not spoken to a lot in the last few years, and I got a phone call out of the blue because they were in the apology part of the stages of their recovery of their 12 steps. And if they were truly a narcissist, I would not have received that phone call at all. Exactly.
I agree. I think that's the difference between those two things.
And our last question, it goes like this. I've heard about peptide addiction and narcissistic abuse. There's a correlation people talk about. Can you explain this? Is it a real thing?
So we're getting into neurobiology, neurotransmitters, and so to sort of keep it really surface level, and also I'm not a doctor, but peptides are essentially strings of amino acids, right? They're like proteins. Some of them function as neurotransmitters. Some are hormones. And they do a whole bunch of things. They regulate a lot of stuff, and one of those is mood. So there has been research that has found that they have the ability to affect mood in much the same ways that psychoactive drugs affect mood, right? Euphoria, those kinds of things. We've made some matches between some peptides and some of our primary drives. Like this one is called this, and it matches to our sexual drive. It's not a determinant, but it is an influencer. So, and when you put that in the context of addiction that we discussed earlier, for me, I would say that they're more a component of the bigger picture, the bigger cycle of addiction, than being a specific sort of link between those two things. Does that make sense?
Yep. And
okay.
I just want to thank you for being on the show today and giving us all of your experience and helping us with addiction, narcissistic abuse, the combination of both. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And if there's anything you want to say before we sign off today.
Just make some space for wherever you are. I think I would love for your listeners to take a deep breath, be accepting of where they are in the moment, and work from there. No need to wish you were here or doing this or that. Just start today and prioritize self. If you do that, I think you're gonna start feeling better over time. So I'm grateful to have been on the show. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy our conversations. So thanks.
And I hope to have you on again. We can do social media, because we could go on forever about that one.
I'd love it. That'd be great.
So for everyone who is listening, one more time, you can find Brandee Smith at fortifycounselingservices.com. I will have that in the description of the show, as well as her email. You can hire her. She is statewide in the state of Texas. And when the COVID-19 restrictions have been taken away, she will be able to see people in person in Austin, Texas. And once again, thank you for being on the show. And for everyone else who is listening, I hope you have a good night.